Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. This one, the Griekwastad murders, written by Emma. Thank you, Emma. For the show, if you're brand new here, hello. Emma's written something for me. This episode, in fact. I've never read it before. We're going to explore it together, dear audience. That's the format of the show, and let us jump in. In December 1979... Going back in the day, aren't we? Representatives from the United Kingdom, the country known as Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, and the ZANU-PF met at Lancaster House in London and signed the Lancaster Agreement. On the 21st of December 1979, the Rhodesian Bush War officially ended, and the next year, Robert Mugabe would become the first black president of Zimbabwe. One of the goals of Mugabe's regime was to give poor black Zimbabweans access to land, since the white majority owned 51% of agricultural land in Zimbabwe. This meant that the ruling ZANU-PF party had to convince the white owners of that land to sell their farms so that black families could take back ownership of their ancestral lands and support themselves once more without having to depend on the white man's kindness. This led to a third of Zimbabwe's white farmers leaving the country and settling in other countries instead. But the rest refused to sell, and in 1997, Zimbabwe implemented their fast-track land reform program. This gave the Zimbabwean government the power to forcefully confiscate white-owned farms, leading to the infamous land grabs, which saw black communities forcefully occupying white-owned farms. This turned once prosperous farms into graveyards, caused widespread famine, and in the next decade, several factors would result in Zimbabwe becoming an economic wasteland. Yeah, Zimbabwe... That's the country with a crazy hyperinflation rate, where it was like they had notes that would be like 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. And it's like, what does it buy you? Bread. One slice of bread. At the same time, however, there was a noticeable spike in the number of farm attacks taking place all over South Africa. Farmers of all races became the targets of violent armed robberies and attacks, and it felt as if we were constantly hearing reports of another family being killed. Well, yeah, it sounds like a pretty intense time. The South African police... that's going on in South Africa, a different country. The South African police established specialized task teams to help tackle the influx of murder cases, and they started working alongside the local communities to investigate these crimes and bring the perpetrators to justice. But the reports of how these families had died were grim. The dogs guarding their homes would be poisoned so that they wouldn't sound the alarm. Their farm workers were killed, and the family members dragged from their beds. They would then be tied up while their attackers ransacked their homes for any valuables and cash they had in their possession. Their gun safes would be emptied, their homes looted of food and anything worth selling, and their vehicles became the getaway cars. If the family was lucky, that'd be the end of it. If not, their mutilated bodies would be found days later, and their deaths were usually anything but quick and painless, involving anything from being shot, hacked to death with a machete, being burned with acid, or doused in petrol or oil, or set alight. Jesus Christ. Did this have anything to do with those land reforms going on in Zimbabwe, or is this just at the same time? They must have something to do with it, right? It's too much of a coincidence. According to the South African Police Service, 9,405 attacks on farms were reported between 1996 and 2012, and 1,384 people were murdered in the process, including not only farmers, but their employees and families as well. This led to white nationalists claiming that a white genocide was occurring and further strained white versus black relations just a few years after apartheid had ended. I mean, yeah, apartheid ends, but it's not like, all right, now there's no more racism. It's just like legally because it ended doesn't mean that people's minds are just suddenly going to be like, oh, it's all good now. In the majority of these cases, however, it isn't hatred that motivated these attacks, but simple greed, and farmers are just much more vulnerable because of their isolation. Since the small local police forces can't patrol the vast stretches of land 24/7, farming communities have implemented neighborhood watches and patrols and do daily wellness checks on their neighbors at set hours of the day. Usually, the patrol leader will do a roll call at a set time every night, and the families will confirm that all is well. At first, most used handheld radios for this, but apps like Zello have... Oh wow, we're talking present day! I was confused for a moment about the tenses. Like, why are we talking about it in present day? Because this is present day, this is still going on, okay? But apps like Zello have made it that much easier since you don't have to be home to call in, and even if you sound the alarm late at night, say 2 a.m. because someone tried to steal your cattle, your house and the surrounding area will be swarming with armed men and women within minutes of the call going out. I know this from experience. Yes, Emma's in South Africa, that's where she lives. So, experience. Zello, I assume, is like WhatsApp or Telegram or something. But every time a call goes unanswered, or the phone rings late at night, dread fills the hearts of these isolated farmers, and the entire farming community bands together to investigate, praying that they aren't about to come across the bodies of their violently murdered friends or family. Shortly after 7 p.m. on Friday the 6th of April 2012, a call went out to say that a family had been murdered during a farm attack that evening, and the details of what had transpired at the Steenkamp's farm that day threatened to tear the entire community apart. The narrow escape on No Hook. Griekwastad is a speck of a town in the vast and mostly empty Northern Cape province. Its main street is lined with houses, rundown storefronts, a church, petrol station, a post office, a farmer's supply store, a restaurant and a guest house, as well as a police station. The town's 6,500 residents mostly live and work on the farms that surround the town, and as soon as the sun sets, it becomes a ghost town, barely noticed by the long-haul truck drivers that drive through town on their way to either Uppington or Kimberley. It was the start of the Easter weekend, and since it was a public holiday, the town was quieter than usual. Shortly before 7 p.m, the roar of a speeding vehicle echoed through the empty streets, and a dusty Isuzu Bucky came to a stop in front of the police station. The noise drew the attention of Henriette Truter, the manager of the Provian restaurant and guest house. She had been smoking a cigarette and drinking a coffee on the guest house stoop when she saw a familiar teenage boy jump out of the Bucky and run toward the police station. Then she heard him yell something along the lines of, "You have to come, they've been shot, everyone's dead." Warrant officers Anthony Wilt and Klaas Roy were the only officers on duty that night, and they looked up from the front desk to see the teenage boy run into the police station. He had short brown hair and wore black rugby shorts and a t-shirt. At first glance, he looked just like any other barefooted white farm boy in the area. It was the blood that covered his arms and face that drew their attention. And the next words had them jumping into action. "My dad and mum and sister have just been shot dead on our farm." The blood-covered boy then led Warrant Officer Roy outside and showed him the discarded weapons he'd found on his way to the police station. It was the revolver and rifle that had been used to murder his family. "Why did you pick them up, dude? Leave them where they are." From across the street, Henriette listened to their conversation, and she realized something horrible must have happened. She finished up her cigarette, made up a glass of sugar water, and walked across the street to the police station to see if she could help in any way. So this kid picks up those guns with his fingers, putting his fingerprints all over them, and he's also got blood all over himself. I don't want to say it, but I mean, I might be thinking that the police might want to look into this guy. Maybe. Warrant Officer Roy took charge and led the panicked boy to the back of the building. They sat down on a concrete bench in the courtyard that separated the police station from the holding cells, and Warrant Officer Roy calmly asked the boy to explain what had happened. The boy was Don Steenkamp, the 15-year-old son of Dion and Crystal Steenkamp. His parents were well known to Warrant Officer Roy, and he listened with a sinking feeling in his stomach as Don explained that his parents and sister had been killed in an attack on their farm, No Hook. Don explained that his family had been watching television in the living room. Don was in the barn sharpening his collection of hunting knives when he heard shots coming from the house. He hid behind a workbench in the barn and listened as more shots echoed over the yard. When they died down, he waited for a few minutes to make sure that the coast was clear before he ran towards the house. He didn't see anyone else in the yard or near the house, and he entered the house through the back door and into the kitchen. There he found his sister, his mother, and his father had all been shot multiple times. His father and mother were dead, but his 14-year-old sister, Martella, was still alive, and he rushed over and picked her up. She clawed at his t-shirt, crying in pain, and eventually died in his arms. Oh, Jesus Christ. Okay, I feel bad now. This is how the blood got on him, right? Don knew that he needed to go and get help. He grabbed the keys to his father's Isuzu Bucky and ran back to the barn. He jumped into the Bucky and raced out into the night, heading towards the town. The farmyard was surrounded by a fence to keep their 4 dogs from pestering the horses and other farm animals, and the gate was still closed, forcing Don to come to a stop. When he got out of the Bucky, Don noticed that his father's rifle and his mother's revolver had been left next to the gate. He didn't want anyone to steal them, so he picked them up and put them in the back of the Bucky. Really? That's what you're thinking about? This seems just a little bit unlikely. He closed the gate behind him and raced to the compound where their black farm workers lived, next to the main entrance to the farm. They had the day off and were gathered around a fire listening to music and drinking beer. Don came to a screeching halt next to the entrance to their shared yard and yelled at the people who were gathered around the fire, warning them that someone had attacked the family and that it wasn't safe for them to be there. He then raced the 10 kilometers to town, hoping that someone would be able to help him. While Don shared the details of what he'd been through in the past hour, Warrant Officer Wilt alerted all the police officers in the province of the crime, including the local detective branch based in Kimberley, 150 kilometers away. To his knowledge, this was the first time a farm murder had occurred in their region, and back in Kimberley, a task force was quickly cobbled together to catch the persons responsible. Meanwhile, Henriette had made her way toward the back of the police station and had caught the tail end of Don's story. Henriette just sticking her nose in. I know she means well, but it's like, hello. I'm just curious about what's going on. Got my sugar water, which is weird. She and Warrant Officer Roy watched as Don stripped off his blood-stained shirt and washed his sister's blood from his arms and face. When Henriette asked Don why he was cleaning the blood from his hands and arms, he replied, "It's my sister's blood. She died in my arms." I mean, it's not unreasonable. Why are you cleaning that blood off? What, you want me to leave the blood on? Within 30 minutes, the police station was swarming with police officers who got dressed in bulletproof vests and armed themselves with 9mm pistols and R5 assault rifles. Warrant officers Roy and Wilt were ordered to stay behind and keep an eye on Don, and the rest of the police force jumped into their vehicles and raced off into the night, passing the drunken farm workers who were slowly making their way to the safety of the police station on foot. 10-kilometer walk? Shit. Henriette gave Don the glass of sugar water she had made for him and offered to take him to the restaurant where he could have something warm to eat and drink before they contacted the rest of his family. The warrant officers, more concerned with listening to the excited chatter on the police radio, agreed to her plan, completely failing to secure their only witness and any evidence that he might have brought with him. Yeah, they were also just totally chill with him, like washing the blood off. It's like, not brilliant police work, is it? Henriette opened the restaurant, sat Don down at one of the tables, and gave him a jacket to wear. Lost in thought, the 15-year-old Don repeatedly asked her what he should do next. They're all dead. What's going to happen to me? Where will I go now? According to Henriette, I did not know what to tell him. How do you comfort such a child? Oh my god, I have no idea what to say. Henriette contacted her boss, who in turn told the rest of town what had happened, and soon the restaurant was filled with people offering to help the 15-year-old Don in any way they could. While they waited, Don sat in a corner, texting someone on his phone. When Henriette asked Don who she should call, he used his cell phone to call his father's cousin and grandparents, but he didn't make any sense when he tried to tell them what had happened, and Henriette ended up breaking the news to the family. Don asked whether he should tell his school friends what had happened, but she told him that the whole world didn't have to know what tragedy had befallen the Steenkamp family. But of course, that's exactly what happened. Griekwastad hadn't had a murder in years, and now they had 3. The news spread like wildfire, and by the next one, you're in a town of 6,500 people. Your school friends are gonna find out it's a small town. Remembrance posts and well wishes were shared on Twitter and Facebook, and right-wing organizations like the infamous AWB, South Africa's own neo-Nazis, got involved and blamed the murders on Griekwastad's black community. The EFF sent their condolences, the ANC called for calm, and soon the whole country was discussing the murders and coming to their own conclusions regarding what had happened that night. The Steenkamp family. It's almost a cliche to say that no one expected anything like it to happen to the Steenkamps. The 44-year-old Dion Steenkamp was a third-generation farmer on Newport, and just like his father before him, he had been born on the farm. He was big, tall, broad, had short brown hair and a matching beard, wore glasses, and often tended to come across as serious and stern, despite being a real teddy bear. According to his sister, quote, he was a friendly, firm, and understanding person. My husband thought him to be very wise, and he could get the best out of any 4x4 vehicle if given the opportunity. That's what he's most notable for. Okay. Dion had a degree in maths and computer science, was a church deacon, a member of the Farmers Union, and a hard worker, and ran the family's 5 farms with an experienced hand. He used to help his children with their maths homework, train the national under-18 tent pegging teams. That's a thing. Okay, South Africa. Is that just people who peg tents, like where you put the pegs on the outside of the tent? Why do you need a team for that? And the family often traveled to attend the tent pegging championships. All right. And for those who, like me, have no idea what tent pegging is, it's an equestrian sport. Okay, it's like horse stuff. Similar to polo, where the rider has to pick up ground targets using a lance or sword while galloping past on horseback. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. 10-year-old Simon thought fencing, like with the little swords, was about making fences. And I went to a new school, and all of my mates at the new school were doing fencing club on Tuesdays. And I was like, you just go there and make fences? And I was like, okay, if everyone's going to this, I guess it's going to be good. So I go to a fencing club and everyone's like hitting each other with swords. And I'm like, oh my God, this is much cooler than I thought. It's popular in Australia, India, Israel, Oman, Pakistan, and South Africa, and dates back to the 4th century BC. Dion's 43-year-old wife, Crystal, was known to dote on her husband and had shoulder-length dark blonde hair. She loved gardening and cooking and ran a newly established and successful business, Scrumptilicious, from home, baking and selling biscuits, aka cookies, when she wasn't busy with other events in the community. She also worked as a freelance journalist for the provincial Afrikaans daily newspaper Volksblad, and as a result, her children's accomplishments in tent pegging often featured in the newspaper. Her sister later said, "My sister was the type of person you could run for help any time of the day, regardless of how busy she was." Don and Martella attended separate boarding schools in Bloemfontein, 330 kilometers away from Griekwastad, and their parents went to collect them every weekend to make sure that they got to spend as much time with their kids as possible. On the weekends. If you want to spend as much time with your kids as possible, why are you sending them to boarding school? 15-year-old Don was his mum's favourite and was the quieter of their two children. He attended the prestigious Grey College in Bloemfontein and was popular and happy in school. He loved farming, hunting, and playing pranks on others, was on the school's rugby and cricket teams, and competed in the men's national tent pegging team. According to Aunt Marion Smith, Don was, quote, such a happy-go-lucky, jolly child, quiet, but always ready with a joke. 14-year-old Martella was a daddy's girl and was a local beauty. She attended Orangi Girls' School in Bloemfontein, had long, dark blonde hair and big brown eyes, and was a dream student who did extremely well in school and excelled at sports. She loved horse riding and the outdoors, competed in the girls' national tent pegging team, and often went out for a ride on her beloved Lipanza Bopud Mix 33. Oh, it's a type of horse. I'm like, what is this? What is this mysterious contraption that she's riding? And it's a horse, obviously. The family was active and well-liked in their community, and after the violent attack on the family, the entire community of Griekwastad speculated over what could have motivated anyone to murder them. Well, it doesn't matter how nice they are. If someone wants their money and the shit in their house, they don't really care how they are, do they? Sure, they were wealthy, but most of their wealth was invested in their farms and livestock, so the family led a modest life. They treated their employees well, and they didn't have any enemies in town either. But as soon as the media started reporting on the details of what had happened that night, it didn't take the rest of South Africa long to start asking questions why Don had been the only one left alive. Well, because he was in the barn. I mean, right? But I had those suspicions as well. Farmer, wife, and daughter killed. One of the first people on the scene was Joe Schultz, one of the Steenkamp's neighbors and a member of the Farmers Union. He had been one of the first people who'd been called when the news started spreading that the Steenkamps had been attacked, and he left a family gathering to go and find out what had happened. When he arrived at the Steenkamps' home, he was stopped by Detective Warrant Officer Sebastian Mofokeng, the head of the local detective branch. Detective Mofokeng was familiar with Schultz since he often assisted the police whenever a farm attack took place, and he allowed Schultz to enter the crime scene. Detective Mofokeng had been alerted that a white Ford 1400 Bucky had been abandoned some 5 kilometers from the farm, and it looked like there were bloody handprints on it. He was on his way there and asked Schultz to help the rest of his team secure the crime scene. Schultz packed up his Bucky outside of the gates to the farmyard and made his way towards the brightly lit house where 2 police officers were on guard. He introduced himself, and they allowed him to enter the house on the condition that they follow him. Their conversation was interrupted by the barking of the family's anxious dogs, and one of the police officers shone his flashlight towards them. The dogs, 3 border collies and Jack Russell, were running circles and kept barking at the police officers. That's when Scholes noticed that their muzzles and paws were stained with blood. Upon closer inspection, he discovered a pool of blood underneath a shrub, so he covered it with an empty 200-litre oil drum to keep the dogs from destroying evidence. When Scholes entered the house, all of the interior lights were on, and he was shocked at the amount of blood that covered the kitchen floor and cabinets. He stepped around it and continued through the kitchen. Based on the empty plates and dirty dishes that covered the kitchen countertops, the family had just finished eating dinner when they'd been attacked. Charles made his way toward the breakfast nook, where he found Martella and Crystal's bodies. Martella lay on her back, close to her mother, and her eyes were bruised and swollen. She'd been shot several times, and Schultz noticed there were grass stains on her clothes. Crystal lay on her stomach and had been shot in the back. Dion's body was in the living room, and it looked like he'd been running at his attacker when he'd been shot. Schultz slowly made his way through the house, but it didn't take him long to realize that something was wrong. He'd attended several lectures and workshops on farm attacks, and he'd been to a few crime scenes, and the first thing he noticed was that everything was still in place. Yeah, if this family is likable and nothing's been nicked, Very strange motivations. The only member of the family alive is the son. I'm suspicious. There wasn't any overturned furniture, the victims hadn't been tied up or restrained, and their cell phones and other valuable items hadn't been taken. As he walked through the house, he noticed the gun safe was open, but the rest of the family's valuables, guns and ammunition were still neatly packed inside. And when the farming community started calling Scholes, asking whether they should start blockading the roads to keep the suspects from getting away, Scholes told them, "No, there is no point. This was not a farm attack. I believe something else happened here." Colonel Dick DeWall was the head of the Northern Cape's Organised Crime Unit, or the Hawks. At the time, he had been appointed as the lead detective on the case. He drove all the way from Kimberley that night and arrived at the police station at 9 that evening. Parked cars lined both sides of the street, and a large crowd had gathered outside the restaurant across the street. Colonel DeWall introduced himself to the warrant officers on duty and was given a brief explanation of what had occurred since Don Steenkamp had come running into the police station just 2 hours earlier. When asked whether they'd started collecting any evidence yet, the warrant officers responded that Detective Mufakeng was currently at the crime scene and they'd been instructed to look after Don. When Colonel Duval asked where the witness was, the warrant officers had to admit that he'd left and was now drinking coffee at the restaurant across the street. Which, I mean, if you've got no reason to suspect him, that seems perfectly reasonable. You're not going to keep him in the police station. It seems perfectly reasonable that he can go across the street to have a drink. Colonel DeWall walked past the Isuzu Bucky and that was still parked outside the police station and found Don surrounded by concerned community members. When he asked to speak to the boy, he was immediately confronted by Andre Steenkamp. This was Dion's cousin who had agreed to escort Don back to the police station so that Colonel DeWall could question him. While they made their way to the police station, Colonel DeWall's practiced eye made a note of everything that was wrong with Don's appearance. Warrant officer Roy had mentioned that the boy had been covered in blood when it arrived in town, but now was wearing a clean t-shirt and his arms and legs were spotless. There was blood in one of his nostrils, suggesting that his nose had been bleeding at some point during the night. Colonel DeWall also noticed a scratch mark on Don's neck, but it wasn't red and raised, so it probably wasn't new. What's more, Don didn't seem traumatized. He hadn't been crying and was constantly texting on his phone as they made their way to the police station. They entered the station commander's office, and Colonel DeWall told Don that the officers on the scene had confirmed that his parents and sister were indeed dead. In response, Don wanted to know if this meant he would inherit everything since he knew that his parents had set up trust funds for him and his sister. Bro, that's the first question you asked? That's insane. Could you look more guilty asking that? Colonel DeWall explained that he shouldn't worry about it now and that they had to process him for any evidence he might have brought with him. Don agreed, and Colonel DeWall asked Lieutenant Andre McAnder, the Northern Cape's CSI unit commander, to process Don for any evidence. He was assisted by Constable Stephen Mahitley, who tested Don's hands for residue that could indicate that he'd fired a firearm. They also took photos of Don, focusing on the scratch mark on his neck and traces of blood on his chin and left leg. They took DNA samples from beneath Don's fingerprints, confiscated his shorts and the t-shirt he'd left outside in the courtyard, and took photos of the weapons that were still in the back of the Bucky before processing those as well. When Colonel DeWall asked Don why he'd cleaned the blood off his arms and hands, Don responded, "It's my sister's blood. I was disgusted by it. I had to get it off, so I asked if I could wash myself." With the promise that he would return the boy to the police station the next day, Andres then took Don to his house, and Colonel DeWall and his team made their way to No Hook. They passed the white Ford Bucky that had been abandoned at the side of the road and stopped to make a note of its number plate. Once they reached the farm, Colonel DeWall made note of how long it had taken them to get to the farm from the police station. His team cordoned off the crime scene, got dressed in their white moon suits, took a video recording of the scene as they found it, and for the remainder of the night, they processed everything, making a note of the layout of the scene and the locations of the bodies. A police helicopter was already busy searching the skies for any signs of intruders, and the K9 unit was also out patrolling, trying to see if they could find any signs of the intruders that Don had insisted had killed his family. They found tread marks outside the main gate to the property and photographed them, and they would later be matched to the white Ford Bucky. Inside the house, they took samples of the blood that covered the kitchen, the breakfast nook, and the living room. There was blood on the home telephone and what seemed like drag marks around Crystal and Dion's bodies. They made note of several sets of fingerprints and took photos of the various cell phones and laptops that lay around the house simply untouched. It's very weird. This isn't a robbery. I'm so leaning towards this being a family job. If it's not, that's really bad. But I feel like I feel like it is. The question about inheritance so immediately afterwards is just like, oh, bro, come on. Outside the house, the police found 2 glasses on the lawn and 2 bullet holes in the surrounding buildings. One had hit the side of the barn, indicating that the shooter had been standing inside the kitchen door. The other had hit the side of the prefabricated house and had passed through the wall. They also uncovered the pools of blood underneath the shrub and took samples to see who it belonged to, but their investigation was interrupted several times because the family's dogs kept barking at them. Don't you have people to come in and control the dogs while you process a crime scene? The next morning, Colonel Duval asked that Don should be taken to a doctor for a thorough checkup, after which Colonel Duval had to obtain permission from Don's legal team to take him to the crime scene. Don and Andreas Steenkamp escorted Colonel Duval to No Hook, where Don walked Colonel Duval through the crime scene, showing him the work table where he'd been busy sharpening the knives the previous night, the window under which he'd hidden when he heard the shots, recreated the moment when he came across his family, and showed them where he'd found the firearms. The rest of the firearms that were in the safe were collected so that they could be sent for ballistic testing, as well as another bloody shirt that had been tossed in a corner in Don's bedroom. If that's you getting rid of evidence. How do you get rid of the evidence? I just tossed it in the corner. No one will find it there. When a member of Colonel Duval's team picked up the shirt, Colonel Duval noticed that the shirt had been torn in several places, which indicated that Don might have been involved in a struggle when his family were killed. Dude, this is the sloppiest shit that I've ever seen, if this is what actually happened. When Colonel Duval asked Don who the t-shirt belonged to, he admitted that it was his. He'd been wearing it when the attack had happened, but because it was covered in blood, he'd taken it off before he left for the police station. Colonel Duval then asked Don how he'd gotten the scratches on his neck, and Don admitted that he and Martella had been in a fight earlier that morning, and that she'd scratched him. Dude, come on now, please. It's ridiculous. When Colonel Duval asked him what the fight was about, Don said he didn't remember. Back at the police station, Don made his first official statement to the police, but his story had changed and become longer, more detailed. That's not good. That's not making them believe you more, Don. Don explained that the family had attended the Easter service at church that morning. They returned home for lunch, and at around 5 p.m. they'd sat outside on the lawn and watched the herd of wild kudu that were scattered around a waterhole a short distance away. Around 6 p.m. they went inside to watch a rerun of the beloved and popular Afrikaans sitcom Vet Cook Parlays, aka Fat Cake Palace. It's about a small family-run restaurant that serves fat cakes like savory beignets. Oh no, I don't know what a beignet is. And the antics from the various family members that they get up to is actually hilarious. Okay. His mom sat down to do some work on our laptop. His dad and sister were gathered on the couch, and Don went outside to sharpen his knives in the barn. The barn was around 30 meters away from the house, and Don could see the kitchen door from the window. He was in there for maybe 15 minutes when he heard several shots. Martella started screaming, and Don hid next to the workbench and underneath the window so that he couldn't see what was happening outside, but he immediately knew that it was a farm attack. When the shots died down, Don got up and looked out of the window, but he didn't see anyone else. He ran inside and discovered the bodies of his parents, and his sister was still alive and had been trying to use the home telephone to call for help, so he picked her up to comfort her. She held on to him, tore at his shirt, and told him that she loved him, and then she died in his arms. It sounds like I don't want to be accusing like old Don here of pretty horrific crimes before we know. But right now it seems like maybe she was going for the telephone, and I mean, if she's dying from a gunshot wound, she's not going to be she's going to be tearing at your shirt to that extent, really? It sounds more like, in my opinion, that maybe she was going for the telephone and you were like, no you don't. He was disgusted by the amount of blood on his shirt, so he went to his room to change into a new shirt and then went down to the barn. That's when he heard a second volley of shots. Thinking the attackers were coming for him, he hid in the barn for several minutes before jumping into the buggy and driving away. He found the guns lying next to the gate and picked them up, despite knowing that he shouldn't have touched them since they were now covered in his fingerprints. I mean, also, they're his guns, so they could be covered in his fingerprints anyway. He warned the farm workers that the family had been murdered and that they had to get to safety, and then drove to town. Don didn't see anyone else following the first round of shots. He hadn't heard the dogs barking before, during, or after the attack. He didn't notice the white Ford Bucky that had been standing outside the main gate to the farm. As far as he knew, his parents didn't have any enemies, but his dad had sold a Bucky to Mr. Whippy Deerling for 20,000 Rand or $1,100, and Mr. Deerling still owed his father the money. After Don finished his statements, he was taken to Kimberley, where he was soon surrounded by his remaining family. According to his Aunt Marianne, quote, he arrived there late at night, accompanied by his best friend's family, the Heckroots, and announced that he was going to their farm. It was weird for us, and he just continued to remain with the Heckroots after that. I'm an adult, and I wanted to be close to my family during that crisis, my flesh and blood. We all expected he would feel the same way. The quote ends. That afternoon, Colonel Duvall declared that the house had been cleared of evidence and it was thoroughly cleaned. The dishes from the family's last meal together were washed and put away, the blood was wiped from the kitchen cupboards, Dion's blood-stained jacket was destroyed, and the blood-soaked carpet in the living room was burned. Why? You've got to have put some of this into evidence, no? The jacket? Like, I understand, like, a plate's got to be cleaned, but the blood-stained jacket, you're just straight up burning. Or what did they say? Destroyed or burned? Yeah, it was destroyed. Why? Just put it in a box and put it in a warehouse like you see in the movies. Their friends and family left flowers and letters to the deceased members of the Steenkamp family at the main gate to their farm, and that Sunday the whole town gathered in the local church and mourned the loss of Dion, Crystal, and Martella. The boy who lived... Day after the news broke, the media descended on Griekwastad. Soon, every room in the guest house was filled, and people started renting out their empty rooms to the hordes of journalists that arrived in town in their shiny cars. The Provian restaurant became the main gathering place for the journalists, and they crowded around the police station and questioned everyone in town. And even though the townspeople were willing to speak to the media, they weren't able to provide them with any useful information. Yeah, this is the thing. Like, if you're a journalist, why are you going there and staying there? Surely you go there, you take some photos, you talk to a few people, but there's not going to be new information coming out. Well, maybe there is. I guess as the police investigate. It just seems like a lot of the time you're just going to be sitting around waiting for news. Is that what journalism? Is that a lot of journalism? Is that what journalism is? Just sitting around waiting in the cafe, being like, see what the police have to say. The police were only willing to say that they didn't have any suspects yet, but explained that the autopsies had been finalized and all the forensic evidence had been sent away for testing. Or, in the case of that jacket, just straight up burns. But it wasn't long before the media reported that the murder of 3 members of the Steenkamp family was not your typical farm murder. Jacques Steenkamp, a journalist. Wait, does he have the same surname? Oh, he does, but it's with a K and not a C. Okay, just a little confusion there. A journalist for Rapport who'd broken the news of the murders even went so far as to ask why there wasn't a sign of forced entry, why nothing was stolen, and why Don was the only one who had been spared. Soon, the whole of South Africa started speculating that 15-year-old Don had been responsible for his family's murders because, well, kinda just made sense. Yeah, I can get why they did that speculation because I also did that speculation. A memorial service for Dion, Crystal, and Martella was held on the 12th of April 2012, and hundreds of people attended the funeral. They included a bucky load of Martella's school friends whose bus sustained a flat tire on the way to Griekwastad, prompting the girls to get a lift into town in the back of a police van. Pastor Piet Otto led the service and explained that, quote, "We missed them this morning. We are going to miss them a lot. Dion and Crystal were 2 people who were so actively involved in the community that I don't know how we are going to survive without them. I knew them as 2 people who did everything for God and His Word. Of the 2 kids, Martella was the outgoing, sparkling one. Don was the quiet one." The quiet one sat in the front pew, sandwiched in between his 2 grandmothers. Several journalists were in attendance, and according to journalist Jacques Steenkamp, quote, "Don seemed angry and frustrated by the horde of photographers and journalists who were present, though he did his best to hide it. The media representatives, however, didn't seem in the least concerned that they were being blatantly insensitive on such an occasion. As if to prove that this was no ordinary funeral, their camera lenses were permanently fixed on Don. Why did you let them into the building? It's a private funeral. Just be like, no, journalists, thank you. You're not welcome in here. Get out." Easy. After the funeral, Don went to live with his tent-pegging coach, Bernie Heckroot, and his family on their farm outside of Kimberley, and in time, they'd become his legal guardians. But just 5 days after the memorial service, South Africans woke up to find the headlines reading, "Farm killing, cops suspect teen." Volksblad, the newspaper that Crystal had worked for, reported that the police suspected there had only been 1 shooter. Crystal had been shot first, followed by Dion. Martella had fled for her life before running back into the house to call for help, where she died next to her mother. Quoting the article, "A teenage boy is suspected by police in connection with the murder that took place over the Easter weekend." Just like that, Don's name disappeared from any reports regarding his family's murders. But the media knew he was the only suspect. The people of Griekwastad knew that he was the only survivor, and the people of South Africa already thought he was guilty of murdering his family. It's going to be a bit of a twist if it turns out it's not actually got anything to do with him, right? When Bernie Heckroot informed Don that he was the main suspect, Don reportedly said, "I really can't believe that people would think such a thing. Why would I kill my own parents and sister?" I don't know, probably plenty of reasons, mate. It's always the fucking family. That's like saying, "Oh, I'm the husband. Why would I kill my wife?" she's my wife, which makes sense prima facie, but then you look at the statistics and you're like, it's always the husband. Don was planning on returning to Grey College on the 16th of April, just 10 days after his family's murder, but the day before he had to report to school, the recruits got a call to let them know that Don had been suspended by the school board. After all, Grey College is known for educating future leaders and top sportsmen like Riek Neethling, the Olympic swimmer, rugby players like Bismarck du Plessis and Johan Goosen, and the legendary, if infamous, cricket player Hansie Cronje. Oh, I don't know who any of these people are or why this dude's infamous. And honestly, if they were British, if this was going on in the UK, I probably wouldn't also, because I know nothing about sports. Grey College is not the type of school you associate with someone who'd murdered his whole family. Of course, the recruits insisted that Don was innocent and appealed the suspension. When the media reported that Don wouldn't be returning to school, Grey College received a lot of backlash from members of the public who believed in Don's innocence. I mean, to be fair, it is innocent until proven guilty, and trial by media is not really great. They insisted that Don hadn't been found guilty yet and shouldn't be punished for something he didn't do, and Don was allowed to return to school on the 3rd of May, 2012. Good. I mean, that's how it should be, because it's innocent till proven guilty. Although it's a private institution, I suppose. Is it a private institution? I'm guessing it's a private school. I'm not sure. They have a right to refuse students, I assume. For the next few months, the media hounded Don's every move. They reported on his presence at a tent-pegging gymkhana that took place in Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape, and published photos and videos of him riding 33, his sister's horse. And when Don and his friends drunkenly celebrated his 16th birthday on the 15th of August, several journalists patiently followed them from bar to bar, reporting that Don seemed anything but heartbroken at the fact that his family wouldn't be able to celebrate it with him. Yeah, his behavior, I give people a lot of slack after death. People deal with it in different ways, but boy, dude, this looks not good for you, does it? But on the 21st of August, just 2 weeks after his 16th birthday, Colonel Duval arrived at Don's school, arrested Don for the murders of Martella, Dion, and Crystal Steenkamp, and personally drove the now 16-year-old to Griekwastad, where he would be held until his bail hearing. According to Colonel Duval, while driving from Bloemfontein to Kimberley, the news broke on OFM's 1 o'clock news bulletin that the boy had just been arrested at Grey College in connection with the murders. I looked in my rearview mirror to gauge his reaction and saw that he was smiling. Dude, the quiet psycho, dude. The bail hearing. Don's bail hearing took place on the 26th and 27th of August 2012 in the Magistrates' Court in Griekwastad. Advocate Hans Kloot, who argued on behalf of the state, declared that they were planning on charging Don with several Schedule 6 offences, most notably premeditated murder, and that in their opinion, quote, "I cannot guarantee the safety of anybody around the child. He is a danger to the public. There are no exceptional circumstances that warrant the suspect being released on bail. If you are charged with 3 murders, it's serious. I can't but use hard words. The minor isn't the victim here and shouldn't be treated as such." Don's attorney, Advocate Coetzee, argued that Don should be granted bail because he had to attend school and had several tent-pegging tournaments to attend. I get the argument for school, but he should be on bail so he could go and do sports. A social worker who'd been working with Don explained that the 16-year-old was adjusting well despite the trauma he'd experienced, but admitted that they never discussed the murders. According to Coetzee, children are regarded in our constitutional dispensation as being so important that all possible methods are explored to try and keep them out of the mainstream criminal justice system. I mean, yeah, unless they're criminals. Therefore, as the child wants to proceed with his education in an environment in which he feels happy, secure, and normal, where he is able to participate in sports, he should be allowed to continue with such. More so because the state's case is based on circumstantial evidence and certain unfounded assumptions made by Colonel Duval. When Colonel Duval was called to the stand on behalf of the state, he related the details of their investigation in full, taking time to go over the crime scene and the evidence that they'd collected. He drew the court's attention to the torn t-shirt that had been found at the scene and explained that they believed that Martella and her attacker had been involved in a struggle before her murder and that she'd torn the t-shirt in the process. He then went on to explain that they'd analysed 72 DNA samples in total, but that no foreign DNA or unknown fingerprints had been found at the scene. He would conclude with, quoting, "After testing all those samples, we were unable to identify or link anyone other than the boy to the crime scene, and there was no indication of any other person having been present on the farm other than the boy and the 3 deceased persons." I mean, yeah, dude, if his fingerprints are all over it, but if there's no one else's fingerprints on there that aren't the family's, it's looking awfully bad for you, my dude. Yes, circumstantial, but real bad. The gunshot residue tests that were done on both of the t-shirts that had been taken into evidence only confirmed that Don had been the one to pull the trigger. Wait, what? Only confirmed that Don had been the one to pull the trigger? Wait, that seems pretty damning. The scratch marks on his neck, his torn shirt, and the DNA traces underneath Martella's fingernails all confirmed that he had attacked her before he shot her. This is pretty goddamn damning. At the end of the proceedings, Magistrate Marswi announced that he'd only deliver his judgment 10 days later, during which time Don would remain in custody. His concerned family members supplied him with coke, snacks, extra food, blankets, and a pillow, and asked whether they could bring him a laptop so that he could watch some movies. Their request was denied. On the 3rd of September, Magistrate Marswi explained that because Don was still underage, the court had to take the Child Justice Act into account when considering the bail application. Magistrate Marswi told the court, "I'm sure my decision won't be very popular, but I believe it's in the best interest of the child that he not be detained pending the outcome of his hearing in the High Court." Whoa! They gave him bail! Shit, I wouldn't have given him bail! Damn! As such, Don was granted bail and went to live with the Heckroots once more. Now that it had officially been charged with his family's murder, Grey College refused to allow him to return to school, but explained that he would be allowed to continue his studies from home. For the next 5 months, Don studied for his exams, attended pegging competitions across the country, and was allowed to go on long solo walks on the Heckroots farm. He was free to do whatever he wished, had hundreds of fans write him letters, and Don reportedly became jovial and arrogant. His biggest cheerleader was the mother of his social worker, Mrs. Cross, who explained that she thought he needed to know that people out there believed he was innocent and had encouraged people to write to him. Is he? I don't know what the age of becoming an adult for a trial is in South Africa, but if it's 16, did he purposefully do it when he was 15 so that he wouldn't be tried as an adult? That would be really psycho and dark, but also possible. Quoting her, "People are so caring and have already accepted Don as part of their own families. One woman wrote that she sees him as an older brother to her own sons. People are praying for him and sending him verses from the Bible. One can see that these people are dealing with their own pain and sorrow and that they are helped by writing about it." The State versus DD. Don's murder trial began on the 11th of March 2013, and it took place at the Kimberley High Court. Because he was still a minor, he had to be referred to as the accused throughout the trial, though the judge hearing this case, Judge Gomo, would later explain that, quote, "Counsel on both sides of the divide mused whether the proverbial horse had bolted before the stable shutters were closed." Don Steenkamp pled not guilty to the 5 charges put to him, and the state called their first witness to the stand. He was Colonel Sightsee Albertsee, and he is a forensic crime expert who's based in Pretoria. He used a computer program called Crime Scene Forensic to recreate a walkthrough reconstruction of the crime scene, and explained that it allowed the viewer to zoom in and look at the evidence left at the scene. It also enabled the viewer to click on the evidence and read the results of forensic reports that related to that piece of evidence. Colonel Albertsee showed the court the locations and conditions of the bodies as they were when the police arrived on the farm around 8 p.m. that night. He showed them the drag marks on the floor, the magazines that lay scattered underneath Martella's body, and the blood that covered the floor, the walls, and the kitchen cabinets. When Detective Mofokeng was called to the stand, he explained that he had been one of the first officers on the scene. He told the court that when he checked on the bodies of the 3 victims, he noticed that there were grass stains and several pieces of grass on Martella's back, suggesting that she'd been outside at some point during the attack. When the defense questioned him about the white Ford Bucky that he'd seen abandoned a short distance from the farmhouse, Detective Mofokeng explained that the Bucky's owner was Jan Luddick, a farmhand who worked for the Steenkamps. When Don had alerted them to the possible danger, a group of them were heading towards town in the Bucky, but it broke down and they abandoned it, choosing to make their way on foot instead. Martha Watermond and Abigail Pietzi both testified that they used to be employed by the Steenkamps and that they'd been socializing with the other farm workers that evening. They'd all had the day off since it was a public holiday, and they were drinking beer around a fire. Martha and Abigail were standing next to the outside toilet when they saw Mr. Dion's Bucky approach the gate around 6:50 that evening. They watched as Don climbed out to open the main gate, and when he was walking back to the Bucky, he realized that 2 of them were watching him. Only then did he warn them that the family had been murdered during a farm attack and that they had to get somewhere safe. They left to warn the other farm workers and fled the farm on the back of Luddick's Bucky, corroborating Detective Mofokeng's testimony. This is open. I mean, it's all really circumstantial, but it's so much circumstantial evidence. When Joe Scholes was called to the stand, he explained how he'd left a family gathering after he'd been notified that the Steenkamp family had been attacked. He explained how he'd discovered the pool of blood outside the house and how he'd come to the conclusion that it wasn't your typical farm murder. He also told the court that he'd known the family well. Scholes had grown up with Dion and had known both Don and Martella since they were babies. He'd spoken to Don a few weeks before the murders and told the court that Don had told him that he wanted to drop out of school. Quoting him, "He told me he was only in that school because his mother was concerned about her image. He said he didn't want to be there, would much rather go to a country school closer to home since he wanted to farm with his father." When Henriette Schroeter was called to the stand, she explained how she'd arrived in a police station with a glass of sugar water and that she'd later taken Don back to the restaurant with her. She explained that he spent most of the night texting on his phone and that he didn't seem that affected by the loss of his family. Quoting her, "He was talking 2 octaves higher and had a few tears in his eyes, but he wasn't crying snot and tears. That night I witnessed grown men cry like babies, while he was barely shedding a few tears." Several witnesses who'd been at the restaurant that night had spoken to Don, and they all testified that Don had told them the family had been watching the sitcom Fet Cook Palace that night. They all agreed that the show aired between 6 and 6:30 p.m. on Friday nights, and that Don had told them that he'd been in the barn for approximately 10 to 15 minutes before he heard the gunshots. Don told Bob de Villiers and his wife that he'd removed the hunting knives from his father's gun safe since, quote, he wanted to clean his knives and put them away because school was starting and he was worried that he wouldn't have time to clean them the next day. When Don arrived, when Don entered the house, after the shots died down, quote, he saw that his sister was still alive, he went to comfort her, and in the process, some of her blood was transferred to his shirt, and his shirt was torn. He also said that it looked as if his father had gotten up from the couch at some point because he was now on the floor. Don's paternal aunt, Marianne Smith, told the court that the day after the murders, they'd flown in from Cape Town to support their nephew. When they arrived in Kimberley, she asked Don to tell her what happened that night, quoting her, "I don't tell me the whole story before I ask him any questions. My first question was, son, why do you think the windows weren't broken? How did the attackers enter the house? And he told me, Auntie, I think they entered the house when we were watching the Kudos and then hid inside the house. And I said, but where could they hide? Don said, the main bedroom's bathroom. And I said, but son, didn't any of you go to the bathroom? Didn't you wash your hands before dinner? Because your mum always insisted on cleanliness. You always had to wash your hands before dinner. But he shrugged and said, I don't know, Auntie. Maybe they hid behind the bed. Bruh. You're going to prison, my dude. The only question is for how long, because you were a minor when this happened. When Don told his auntie about the second round of shots being fired after he'd left the house, she was shocked because it meant that, quote, the attackers were in the same area as the house or even inside the house while Don was putting on a clean shirt. I told him, Don, do you realize that these people were inside the house with you? And he said, it's possible, Auntie. I think so. Bro, if they were really dead, they would have killed you too, wouldn't they? His other paternal aunt, Elizabeth Smith, testified that Don had told her that he'd seen a psychiatrist earlier that day, and that he'd told her that he knew his parents had set up a trust fund for him and his sister. Uh-oh, motive! He wanted to know who would inherit Martella's trust fund. Oh yeah, he asked her right away. And the psychiatrist told him that he'd most likely inherit everything. After all the family's assets were liquidated, Don stood to inherit 23 million rands. Ooh, $1.3 million. Okay. After all of the witnesses had their say, the state called Colonel DeWall to explain how he and his team had approached the investigation. Colonel DeWall explained that when he arrived in Griekwastad, he was still under the impression that he was going to be investigating a fatal farm attack. But then he met Don, and the red flags started popping up. Quoting him, I noted that he did not cry and showed no emotion. He didn't even appear to be very shocked at what had happened. The quote ends. The first indication that he wasn't dealing with a typical farm attack was the scratches on Don's neck. Then there was the crime scene itself. It was too clean. All of the valuables were left intact. There was cash to the value of 4,000 rand in the house, but the victim's wallets hadn't been touched. And when the results of the autopsy report and forensic tests started coming in, he had to face the fact that 15-year-old Don had most likely murdered his family, quoting him again. I could not believe that a boy of his age could be involved in such a crime. I gave him the benefit of the doubt from the start, and we tirelessly investigated every other lead and possibility, but in the end, only he remained the likely culprit. Then the state started calling in their forensic experts. Lieutenant Colonel Gerhard Vermeulen, a senior forensic analyst, was the one who'd analyzed the bloody t-shirt that had been found in Don's bedroom. He explained that the navy blue t-shirt had several patches of Martella's blood on it and that it tested positive for gunpowder residue, meaning that the accused had been wearing the t-shirt when he fired the .22 caliber rifle and the .357 Magnum revolver. During the testimony, Captain Francois Muller, a forensic communications and cell phone analyst, explained that it analysed all of the cell phones that belonged to the 4 members of the Steenkamp family, 7 phones in total. Between 1700 and 1759, on the night of the murders, Don made several calls and listened to a voicemail. It was from a friend of his who'd planned on spending the night on the farm. He called to let Don know that he was no longer coming. No calls or messages were made until 1902, when he called his grandfather, a woman named Romy Luddick, and his girlfriend from the Provian restaurant. At 1749, Dion had called his father. The call lasted 22 minutes, which meant that he had still been alive at least 1811. Crystal had sent 2 messages from her cell phone at 1832 and 1834. A call from Romy Luddick came in at 1902, followed by several calls and messages from concerned neighbours and family who wanted to check up on her. This meant that Crystal Diona Martella was still alive at 1834. Based on the police's calculations, this meant that it took Don 13 minutes to murder his parents and 14-year-old sister. It then took him 10 minutes to race into town, where he reported the murders at 1858. And then came the autopsy results. The forensic medical examiner, Dr. Lemaine Fouquet, explained that she had performed the autopsies on Dion, Crystal, and Martella. They'd all been shot several times with a .357 Magnum revolver. However, they'd all died after being executed with a .22 caliber rifle. But the autopsy results also suggested a possible motive for the murders. Martella had been sexually assaulted in the days before her murder. According to Dr. Fouquet, there were healed scars inside of a vaginal canal. She also had chafing on her vaginal opening, which indicated that she had had sex between 24 and 12 hours before her death. Again, this hadn't been consensual. Quote, something like a quickie, when the vagina isn't properly lubricated, could cause that injury. She also had several scratch marks on her lower back, which were consistent with someone forcefully pulling her pants down, and scratch marks on her buttocks that were made by fingernails. According to Trompels, a forensic medical examiner and an expert in sexual assault, quote, the healed injury shows that she was forcefully penetrated sometime before her murder. The injuries that she had experienced would have been painful. It was not caused by an infection or masturbation. It's difficult to determine the age of such an injury because the vagina has excellent blood flow and therefore it heals very fast. Healing in this part of the body is much quicker than in other parts of the body. It's also important to note that the injury is exactly as it was when she died because there was no more blood circulating through her body, hence no further healing. And when the autopsy results, the ballistic reports and the blood splatter analysis reports were all put together, they painted a grim picture. Yeah, we know what this picture is, and it's really grim. 13 minutes. Back in 2012, the school closed for Easter holidays on the 23rd of March. Dion and Crystal drove down to Bloemfontein to collect their 2 children. For the next 2 weeks, Don helped his dad out on the farm, and this led to Don asking his dad if he could drop out of school and work on the farm full-time. Dion said no, and reminded his son that they'd already had this conversation. Don and Martella both had to obtain university degrees first so that they'd have something to fall back on. This caused some tension between the two of them, but this was nothing new. After all, Don had spent the entire December sulking because he hadn't been allowed to go away on holiday with his best friend. Dion valued family time and had insisted that the family should spend Christmas together instead. On the morning of the 6th of April, the family went to church, and once again, Don suggested that he could just drop out of school and farm full-time. Family friends heard Dion and his son argue, but decided to stay out of it. The family returned home, ate lunch, and then Dion sat down to watch some TV while Crystal got some work done. Then Martella suggested that she and Don should take their horses out for a run. Don didn't spend a lot of time alone with his sister. They went to separate schools, and when they were home, Don helped out on the farm or wandered around the veld shooting meerkats. But he still thought that she was the most beautiful girl he knew. That has serious creepy vibes now. And that afternoon, the two of them were alone in the veld with no one around to see, and Don sexually assaulted his sister. She fought back, but she was smaller than he was. She cursed him, got back on her beloved horse, 33, and raced back home. When Don got back, Martella was sitting next to their father on the couch and refused to meet his eyes. Guilt and the fear of getting caught ate at him, but Don did his best not to show how anxious he was. Around 5 p.m., the whole family went outside and watched the kudu gather at the nearby watering hole before heading back inside at 5:45. Don was expecting a guest that evening, but when his friend called to let him know that he was no longer coming, Don realized that this was his opportunity to right his wrong and keep his family from finding out what he'd done. At around 18:35, Don took the .357 Magnum revolver from the safe in his parents' bedroom, walked down the hall, and aimed the revolver at his mother. Crystal was shot twice in the lower back, incapacitating her, and fell off the chair she'd been sitting on. She hadn't seen her attacker coming. Martella and Dion weren't as lucky. Martella was sitting on the couch when her brother shot her in the chest. The bullet entered her right breast and exited underneath her right armpit. Dion was in the process of standing up from the couch when Don shot him, once in his right shoulder and once in his chest. He collapsed onto the floor, and Don repeatedly hit Dion over the head with the butt of the revolver to subdue him. Then he stalked out of the house to look for Martella. Despite being injured, she had managed to evade her brother and run outside. She's been shot in the chest. Jesus Christ. Where she had hidden in a shrub in the backyard on her way to the barn. Don saw her as soon as he left the kitchen and aimed another shot at her, hitting the barn and the inside of the house when she ran from him. Don then managed to hit her in the chest and Martella collapsed. The two of them fought, but Martella punched him in the face and managed to get away, while a stunned Don tried to stop his nose from bleeding. Weak and losing a large amount of blood, she stumbled into the house and checked on her father. He was struggling to breathe, but he was still alive. Martella then went to her mother's side and grabbed the phone to call for help. But that's when a furious Don caught up with her. She begged him not to hurt her and told him that she loved him. In answer, he repeatedly hit her in the face, spraying her blood onto the kitchen cabinets. Then he left her alone as he made his way down the hallway. Martella crawled to her mother's side for comfort, broken and sobbing, and collapsed next to her. Don took the .22 caliber rifle out of the safe, and when he returned to the living area, he realized that Dion and Crystal were both still alive. Don shot Dion in the side of his head and walked over to Crystal, shooting her once in the back of the head. After he was certain that both his parents were dead, he shot his sister as well. This is unpleasant. I don't like this. The weight of circumstantial evidence. When the 17-year-old Don took to the stand, he was questioned by both Judge Kagomo and the state prosecutor. During his testimony, he did an excellent job of contradicting not only his own version of events and the evidence presented to the court, but common sense as well. He claimed that the attackers had already been inside the house for 42 minutes before the attack. He claimed that he had been in the barn during the attack, and he hadn't turned the lights on, which meant that he had been sharpening his knives in the dark. He hadn't heard Martella scream during the attack. The dogs hadn't barked. He didn't notice the blood when he entered the kitchen. He didn't ask his sister what had happened to her if she knew where the attackers were. He didn't check on his parents, who were still alive at this point. He didn't use his cell phone to call for help, and he couldn't explain why his nose had been bleeding that night. When Judge Kagomo asked Don if he knew that his statements were negatively impacting his case, Don's response was simple. I understand. Don's own defense team also had difficulty proving his innocence. Sure, the pathologist didn't find Don's DNA or semen inside Martella's vaginal canal, but his shirt was covered in her blood, her DNA was found underneath his fingernails, and the gunpowder residue on his t-shirt proved that he'd killed her. By his own admission, the dogs hadn't warned the family that someone had entered the house. His version of events didn't match the timeline, and his fingerprints were all over both the revolver and the rifle. They'd tried, though. They'd tried to suggest that the bruises on Martella's vaginal opening had been a result of her riding her horse that day, but the pathologist said that the injury was too even to have been caused by Martella riding on horseback. It also wasn't caused by either a tampon or a menstrual pad, since she hadn't been on her period at the time of her death. Don's defense teams had even tried their best to discredit the police officers and forensic scientists who'd processed the crime scene shortly after the murder. Yes, the bloodied carpet that Martella and Crystal had died on had been burned shortly after their murders, but it wasn't really relevant to the case. No, they didn't take Martella's fingerprints, but the fingerprints found on the glasses on the lawn outside matched the ones taken from her cell phone and her bedroom. And yes, one of the forensic specialists outright admitted that he'd made some mistakes during his initial sweep of the house, but in his defense, this was one of the most brutal crime scenes he'd ever been to. He'd known both Dion and Crystal, and he'd known Martella since she was a baby. Seeing her body brutalized like that had been hard on him. He's only human. Besides, he'd gone back afterwards and fixed his mistakes, ensuring that the evidence was properly captured and catalogued and sent off to Pretoria for testing. In their closing arguments, the prosecution reiterated their theory that Don had sexually assaulted his sister and then murdered his entire family when she threatened to expose him. The defense insisted that all of the evidence against Don was only circumstantial, and just because he didn't cry or openly grieve after he'd lost his entire family, it doesn't mean that he'd been their killer. No, but there's so much circumstantial evidence. There's a huge weight of circumstantial evidence. Come on now. We gotta send him to prison forever. Even though he's 15, he deserves to be in prison forever. Don's murder trial came to an end on the 9th of December 2013. Due to several delays, it had lasted a whole 9 months. Judge Kagomo delivered his verdict on the 27th of March 2014 and summarized the facts of the case as he understood it. In conclusion, I am satisfied that none other than the minor accused committed all the offences listed in the indictment, as the state in fact proved them, not only beyond a reasonable doubt, but beyond any shadow of doubt. To deal with all aspects proved against the minor would amount to an overkill. The murders were not only premeditated, but were in fact planned and executed with the direct intent to murder. With his entire extended family and the whole of South Africa watching, the 17-year-old Don Steenkamp was found guilty of defeating the ends of justice, as well as the murders of his father, Dion, his mother, Crystal, and the sexual assault and murder of his 14-year-old sister, Martella. On the 13th of August 2014, just 2 days before his 18th birthday, Judge Kgomo delivered his sentence, explaining that, quote, "The girl refused to have sex with him and defended her modesty. In consequence, she was tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered to prevent her from reporting to her parents that she was assaulted. Because the girl's parents would bear witness against the perpetrator, they too had to be eliminated, and were. This is the most plausible motive for the murders." Don was sentenced to 76 years in prison, 20 years for the murder of his father, 20 years for the murder of his mother, 20 years for the murder of his baby sister, 12 years for sexually assaulting her, and 4 years for lying to the police. Judge Kgomo told a smirking Don that, quote, "The old people say, if you don't want to listen, you must feel the pain." The poet Jan F.E. Cilliers wrote in his poem, Tro, that "I like a man who can stand his man. In 2 days, you, Don, are a man. You must now eat your own bag of salt." Unfortunately, though, all his sentences are to run concurrently. Here's the option of applying for parole after 10 years. No, he had 76 years. He had 76 years. And he's 18. So he'd be like 90, 94. He'd be dead. We could have him die in prison. We don't want him. Oh my God, wasn't this happening in 2014? He can be applying for parole this year. No, Don, no, you got to die in prison. Fuck. He also has the option of apply for parole after 10 years. This means that as of the 14th of March this year, Don Steenkamp has been eligible to apply for parole. However, I haven't been able to find any news articles suggesting that he's going to be released anytime soon. If all goes well, he'll only be released in 2034. He'll be 38 by then, and hopefully he'll be poor as fuck. Which brings us to the next topic of discussion. Yeah, he'll definitely be poor, because you can't I'm sure South Africa has a law like every other country where you can't benefit financially from crimes you commit. Like, he can't, that money is going to go to whoever is the next of kin that isn't him. The bloody hands principle. I started writing this script way back in July of 2022. Back then, I got so far as the bail hearing before I decided to put it aside for the time being. I'd suspected that Don had murdered his entire family from the beginning. I hadn't known how brutal their deaths were. I'd completely missed the fact that he'd sexually assaulted his sister. Honestly, I'd stopped following the story as soon as he was arrested in August 2012. But as soon as I delved deeper into the case, it struck me that Dion, Crystal, and Martella's death was such a waste. And the thought that this arrogant little would walk out of prison one day and be 23 million rand richer because of it infuriated me. So I refused to finish the script. No, he won't, because of the bloody hands thing. But then Matt Granzer asked me if I was planning on finishing the script one day. Matt Granzer's another writer for this channel, and I started working on it again. During my research, I came across several news articles explaining that Don's legal team were never paid for their services. In fact, they'd been fired as soon as the trial concluded, a whole 5 months before Judge Kgomo delivered his verdict, because the family couldn't afford to pay them any longer. Turns out, there's a neat little clause in equity law called the bloody hands principle. In Dutch, it states that der blutige Hand niet gern erf. Sorry, Dutch people. It basically means that if you murder, say, your parents and your only sibling, you can't inherit or benefit from their estate in any way. So as soon as the police warned the Steenkamp family that Don was a suspect, Dion and Crystal's estate was frozen until Don's guilt was determined in court. Don's 79-year-old paternal grandfather, Don Sr., had believed in Don's innocence from the beginning. Just hours after he'd received the news of his son's murder, Don Sr. hired his grandson the best lawyers that he could. When Don went to live with the Heekroots, Don Sr. agreed to pay Don's maintenance and legal fees, explaining that it would be paid out of Dion and Crystal's estate. But Don Sr. didn't trust in the new South Africa's legal system's ability to prove his grandson's innocence, so as a safety measure, he left Don 500,000 rand in his will in case he was found guilty of the murders. He then told his wife and daughters that the boy would need something to live on when he was released from prison. But Don's murder trial was stressful, and Don Sr. passed away on the 31st of July 2013 after suffering 3 separate strokes the year following his son's murder. According to Don's aunt Mariana, Don Sr.'s lawyers had already paid Don's legal team an amount of 1.5 million rands by that point. Before the trial ended, they were set to pay another 2 million rands. But that is when Don's grandmother, Betty, and his 2 paternal aunts decided that enough was enough. Don would receive the 500,000 rand his grandfather had promised him and nothing more. Bernie Hekroot, who was Don's legal guardian at that point, argued that the money could come from Dion and Crystal's estate, but the Steenkamps refused, explaining that if they took the money and Don was found guilty, they'd have to reimburse the estate, and they didn't have 2 million rand just lying around. So in the end, the High Court in Bloemfontein ruled that Don would only inherit the $500,000 that his grandfather had left him, and his legal team were quick to point out that it won't be enough to cover the cost of his trial. The trial had already been postponed for 5 months by that point, and when Don's legal team returned to court, they'd delivered a statement listing all of the state's evidence that they wouldn't be contesting in court, shortening it by several weeks and basically handing the case over to the state. However, in the book The Griekwastad Murders, journalist Jacques Steenkamp points out that the family's lawyers had found a loophole in the bloody hands clause. Because Dion and Crystal didn't have any living children who were eligible to inherit, their parents would inherit everything. If one of them were then to leave a portion of the estate to Don, he'd be allowed to inherit. It might not be the full 23 million, but it might still be a sizable portion, enough to settle his debts and ensure that he has something to live on when he's released from prison. No. The court should prevent this, please, somehow. During an interview with Rapport, Dion's sister, Mariana Smith, explained that Don is already being punished for his crimes. Once he'd served his sentence, would it really be fair to continue punishing him by ensuring that he'd never inherit the millions of rand that his parents left him? No, what the f***? You're his sister. Why would you say that? F*** Don. He should get none of that money. That's insane. Dismembered appendices. I've already mentioned that I grew up on a farm. I alluded to it again at the start of this video, and during the 20 years that I lived on the farm, we lost 3 of our neighbors to farm attacks. Jesus Christ, I lost my favorite aunt to one when I was 4. I don't think there's a South African farmer out there who doesn't know someone who's been murdered on their farm. However, they're immortalized on the Nampo Wall of Remembrance in Bothaville, and thousands of white metal crosses on the White Cross Monument in Limpopo represent the farmers who've been murdered in South Africa since 1996. There are currently more than 3,000 crosses planted there. And there's a photo here. Oh my. In 2014, Jacques Steenkamp released his book on the case titled The Griekwastad Murders. In 2020, a movie based on the title, Griekwastad, was released. It starred Arnold Vosloo from The Mummy and tells the story from Colonel de Val's perspective. It's an Afrikaans movie, but if you can, I suggest you check it out. It's really good. And finally, if you want to read this script and any other ones I've written, why not check out my Patreon? Go on then, patreon.com/Emma Freylink. Emma, spelt the normal way, and Freylink, Freylink. Brilliant. Thank you. And that's where we end today's episode, which is super depressing. Thanks for being here.